And we're live. Hi there, I'm Simon Cantan.
And I'm Dave Higgins.
And this is the very first episode of the Nitty Gritty Writing Podcast, where we're going to be discussing our journey writing-wise and what we've found out so far in terms of writing, different tips about writing, outlining, editing, marketing, publishing, everything.
Journey.
Oh, you... Is that? No, that's me. Sorry. Apologies. it's playing it back to me. I thought we'd start off first by discussing who we are and talking about what the podcast is going to be about in this first episode. So you go first, actually, Dave. I'll be a gentleman.
Apparently comments are still disabled, so...
Oh, okay. It shouldn't be.
It shouldn't be. So, briefly lost track of where we were. We were saying who we are, yes?
Yeah, so I thought just introduce ourselves, basically. I can go first, actually. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
I was expecting you to go first.
Okay, yeah, I'll go first. So, as you can tell, we might be a little bit messed up sometimes. So, my name's Simon Cantan, and I'm a science fiction and fantasy author. And I've been self-publishing since 2013, June 2013. I have 14 titles out at the moment, 2 novellas, 3 seasons of Green Star with Dave, and what's that leave? 9 novels. So the seasons are quite long. That's the only reason I distinguish them. My stuff tends to be action-oriented and tends to be comedic, or at least light-hearted. I've got Green Star, as I mentioned, which is kind of a Hitchhikers meet Star Trek thing. Kyra Sarin, which is more... It's probably one of the more serious series I've got, which is Die Hard science fiction in the future. Where Kyra is constantly fighting terrorists and stuff. I've got the Bitter End Fantasy series, which is 6 novels. That one's already wrapped up and finished. That's kind of light-hearted comedic fantasy. And the last one is the Cyberpunk Outlaws series, which I've got 2 books out at the moment, a novelette and a novel. So yeah, so that's where I am. I'm continuing to write fantasy and science fiction. I'm writing a fantasy series with Dave at the moment. And yeah, over to you.
Right, I hesitate to say the straight man of the pair, but my solo work is a lot less humorous than Simon's solo work. So I've got 7 books out at the moment, so I'm still chasing Simon a little. 2 collections of my short stories, one more dark fantasy, one more science fiction. An anthology that I ended up publishing after the original publisher divested the project. The 3 Green Star volumes that Simon's mentioned, and a collection of the first 9 parts of the Swords and Sorcery serial that I'm writing every week. So that's all a lot more grim, dark, and horrific rather than explosions and jokes.
I always think, I mean, it's complete flattery, but I always think we're like Lennon and McCartney, I mean, that you're kind of the Lennon of the 2 of us, and I'm the McCartney. Well, obviously complete flattery, but yes, that was kind of the gist.
You think I'm going to get gunned down?
Oh, I hope not. No, and marry Yoko Ono or whatever.
Well, that's true. You know, don't don't know if I'd like a fan who got that serious about it, but I wouldn't mind a few fans who really loved my work to sort of that extent without feeling the need to kill me.
Yes. Yeah, I think neither of us wish for death at the hands of a fan would be a good point to make. Both of us tend to write speculative fiction, at least. Dave has some kind of horror short stories, at least, that I've read that are horror-ish. And the swords and sorcery stuff you're writing is quite serious, at least as much as I've read.
Yeah, it's all serious. I know.
So, the regular podcast, this is a bit of an exception because obviously we need to introduce ourselves and stuff. So the regular podcast, we're normally going to start not by spouting on about our books and stuff as much, but more about what we're doing that week, writing-wise. So I thought maybe we'll do a brief version of that here to kind of give a taster. And I can go first again. And I would say my week has been a complete disaster writing-wise, because I've had my previous car die. Well, not die, but the motor warning light come on, and then the new car not start, and then the toilet in the upstairs bathroom sprang an explosive leak that sprayed water everywhere. So I was meant to be writing Adventure, which is the second book in the Adventure series, this week, and that didn't really happen. And on the marketing side, I've been doing some Facebook ads, and I found some stuff that kind of works that I might mention later on if we have time. Dave?
Well, I've read, obviously, the bits of adventure you've written, so going through your draft and coming up with some thoughts, working out where to go next, has been big part of my week. Also, I've got a short story in an anthology that's coming out at the start of February, which is using a very contributor-driven collaborative model for everything. So I've been spending...
Oh, have you frozen? Okay, Dave seems to have frozen.
Your image is frozen, but I can still hear your voice. So
was it me that was frozen? Oh, okay. I thought it was you who were frozen. Okay.
One of us froze, but I'm still here. But yeah, so preparing for the release of an anthology start of next month, and I'm considering, just so I can actually run a test for what works for me, releasing some things under a pseudonym, utterly separated from me, just trying something different. So it's my writing, but different marketing and so on, just so I can test that. So I've been thinking about, well, would I want to do that? What would I want to do with it? Is that going to be making a horrifically huge amount of work for myself compared to the benefit?
I mean, I've considered the same. I have one novella that's out under a pseudonym, which is kind of active romance or erotica, whatever you want to call it, which has sold a total of 2 copies in 2 years. And in one way, it was a waste of time in that it hasn't sold anything and no one's interested. I mean, it's the same level of writing as I normally put in.
Yeah.
But in another way, I mean, let me know that was not the greatest move to try. Like, I was trying to write it. I had a great idea and for an active romance, and but I don't read that. So I think that was kind of the mistake. And as well, I tend to be I'm the wrong gender to be writing active romance. And there's plenty of men who can, but I'm not very good at it. So in a way, it kind of ruled that out. So it depends, this early on. So both of us are relatively new to independent publishing. This early on, it's okay to make mistakes, I think.
The one thing I really wanted to play with is being just a little pushier, because my personality, I'm not buy my book. That's not, I like authors who have content more than buy my book in their social media streams. But I am conscious of the fact that I might well be at one end, I might well be at the least buy my bookish end of the spectrum in terms of what I want. And actually, many people would wouldn't like so much as wouldn't dislike a little bit more. But what I don't want to do is lose the social karma I've got for taking a very sort of, here are things that interest me, and then occasionally going, I've got a new book out. Or if someone goes, so tell me about your books, speaking about books, by suddenly adding in buy my book post once a month or whatever. So if I put it on an unconnected pseudonym, if it doesn't go anywhere, I can ditch it. And if it does start to work, and the sales seem to be better for that, I think, well, maybe I can talk about actually my books proactively a little bit more.
Yeah. I mean, I've kind of gone through the same thing, because I'm not pushy either. And I'm doing Facebook book advertising, but so I was looking at Mark Dawson. Mark Dawson has a free 3-video course, and his main tip is pick an author who's similar to you. So I have, humorous fantasy, say. So Terry Pratchett's obviously the leader in that genre. So he said, ask a question like, is this as good as Terry Pratchett? Read here to find out more. Read here to find out. Which I was kind of meh about anyway, but I did the same thing as you were mentioning, trying to push a little bit more to see if it worked. And then it did work. It certainly got more people to click, but then someone posted a comment on the ad and said, I tried reading this. This is no way as good as Terry Pratchett. That's really cheeky what you're doing. Which, I mean, I wouldn't consider myself as good as Terry Pratchett. So I then took that down because it felt kind of scuzzy. And that should be the kind of rule of thumb. If you don't like, it's fine if other people want to do it and they don't mind. But personally, I felt like kind of, icky about doing that. But then I was, as I said, I've mentioned before, like I came up with a Facebook ad that seems to be working now, which is that I say I'm inspired by authors. So fantasy inspired by da 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 da, or if you had a legal thrillers inspired by John Grisham, which in no way suggests that you're saying you're as good as them, and is completely true. I mean, I said Terry Pratchett and Piers Anthony. It's completely true. I read dozens of their books, so I think that's a valid thing to say.
Yeah. And
it felt fine for me to say that because it's a true thing that is, I can stand behind. Yeah. So, on your point, I think personally at the moment it feels like it just requires being a little bit smarter to be pushy without being pushy, I guess.
Yeah.
And so I am terrible at my mailing list at the moment. So for people who are fairly new to writing, Your mailing list is just an email list of people who you send out an email to them every time there's a new book out or something like that. So my open rates drop quite considerably. I managed to get them back up, but that was because there was a new free book in my members area. So that was okay. But I guess I'm bad at this whole marketing thing and being pushy. But, you know, I think it's anyway, to put a cap on it, I think it's a perfectly valid experiment to take under a pseudonym and then see how it goes, because it can't do any harm unless you say something horrendously offensive that people then track down who you really are, but that's not likely. Okay, so that was kind of what we did this week. So we'll go on to the main topic for this episode, which is what this podcast is going to be about. So I'll go into my reasoning behind starting a podcast. So I procrastinated over starting a podcast, or put it off a long time. So I've been thinking about it for probably 2 years. I think I mentioned to you at least a year ago before, Dave, about maybe starting a podcast, and then we couldn't find anyone to do it with. And the reason I've been putting it off is because it is a chunk of time that everyone agrees is not going to net you new readers. So doing a podcast for writers won't tend to lead to masses of readers reading your books. However, there's a number of things. The first is that I've noticed that people who do podcasts get more out of it than more sales. People who do podcasts about writing, it's almost like a live brainstorming / training session where you're coming up with ideas that you might not necessarily have had if you were just sitting there on your own, or even have had if you're watching the podcast, because it's not necessarily tailored specifically to you as a person. And that was part of the reason why I thought that there was a podcast missing. Because I used to listen to this podcast called The Storytelling Podcast with Garrett Robinson and ZC Bolger and Chrissy Moss. And that was a podcast I particularly enjoyed because they were at a level where they were at around about the same level as me in terms of indie publishing. A little bit ahead, I would say, but not like miles ahead. So then I could kind of relate to the stuff they were talking about. And I watch the Self-Publishing Podcast every week. And that's an amazing podcast. But they are miles ahead of where I am. And they're full-time and write incredibly quickly. So they're only going to get further ahead of me. So I felt like maybe there was a space for a podcast that could serve multiple purposes, that it could be both beneficial for me in that I get to kind of talk through the stuff that I'm doing in terms of writing and publishing, and beneficial for people who are around about my level or perhaps below my level, who may be going through the same kinds of things that I'm going through. I don't know if you had anything to add there, Dave?
Well, and one of the reasons I'm interested in doing this is is a result of the asymmetry you mentioned. That a lot of the things I've learned to do, to not do, a lot of the background data that's out there that informs some of my decisions, even if it isn't direct advice, is coming from people who've already done it. People who've got 10 years publishing experience, people who are getting to the point where they could go full-time or have gone full-time and support their family on the income. So not just one person's income, but become the primary earner. And they are incredibly generous with their time and advice. And realistically, whilst some of my life experience outside of writing can be of use to them, and I can be entertaining friend, a supportive ear, or whatever. There's nothing writing-wise probably I can come up with that will be more than taking one of their ideas, putting a little bit of a twist on, and giving it back to them. So I can't pay them directly back. But what I can do is give the next set of people who are where I was before I'd published anything, say, the benefit of all of my experience. So obviously directly, that reduces the number of people who are going to authors who are 5-10 years in the future with their questions. So they don't have to keep reciting basic advice and don't get pestered so much. And secondly, on a more social karma level, it's paying back what I've got because I can't pay it directly. And also, I really love books. I read hundreds of books a year. So anything that increases the number of good books there are out there is good for me.
Mm. I mean, as well, I should mention that talking about writing is certainly something I can do for long amounts of time. I bored the absolute ear off people in work who have no interest. You can see their eyes glaze over as soon as I walk over and say, "Oh, so you know what I've done in marketing my books this week?" "Yeah, what's that?" So this gives me an outlet to actually talk about it without boring people, hopefully. So the other thing I was going to mention is that a lot of the podcasts that are out there talk in terms of strategy. And one thing I'd like to do is talk in terms of tactics in some way. So strategy is certainly, like, it's rules of thumb. Like, for instance, you should always have a mailing list and try and grow your mailing list is a good strategy. Whereas this is a specific Facebook ad I'm running at the moment that sends people to my mailing list and seems to be working, would be a tactic. And I've noticed that a lot of people are reluctant to mention tactics because it means that the podcast that they're making is not evergreen anymore. If you fast forward a year, then watching that podcast wouldn't be all that useful because those tactics don't work anymore. And as well, they're reluctant because something that works for them might not necessarily work for someone else. So I would say that anything we mention as a tactic on the podcast isn't necessarily going to work for everyone, or even more than just me. I mean, it may just be a fluke that is working for me. But yeah, that's another thing that I'd like to try and talk more in terms of concrete terms. So I'm part of a Facebook group, which is just for authors, which there was a recent question, which is, how much do you guys earn a month? Which is kind of a taboo subject for people, for authors. And but in that private group, people answered, and it was very useful because you saw a range of answers. Most people probably saying $10 a month or something like that, and some people saying a couple of hundred, and some people saying 8,000, 10,000, stuff like that a month, which is quite interesting because then you look at what differentiates people. So the 8,000 to 10,000 people were all saying, "Oh yes, I spend $2,000 a month on Facebook advertising, and I spend such and such on covers and such on editing and all that kind of stuff." And you saw that it's not necessarily a guarantee, but the people who were spending massive amounts of money on editing and covers and Facebook advertising were the people who were getting $10,000 a month, and they were also writing romance, but that was kind of a given. So yeah, there was that, and I'm just having a look at our bullet point list. So yeah, I mean, it's about connecting with people. So there's plenty of authors I've met through Google Plus and Facebook and Twitter and things, and I've read some people's books. And unlike Dave, I'm a very picky reader. So Dave reads hundreds of books. I read a couple of dozen books a year, maybe. And out of those, there's probably, you know, if I finish a couple of dozen, I've probably started hundreds and turfed a lot of them on the first page. So, yeah, my point was that I've met some authors whose books I have loved and finished, and that's a very beneficial thing as well, in that you're making friends with someone who's writing books that you really enjoy is quite good fun. Like John L. Monk springs to mind. His Jenkins cycle was very good. He has a trilogy called the Jenkins cycle, which I'd recommend. So, yeah, there's multiple benefits, I think, that are not necessarily us selling more books. So the point being, that's why we're kind of doing the podcast. So, yes. So, was there anything else I wanted to go into? Yeah, so we wanted to put a call out there for a third host. We're looking for people who are available at this time, which is 8:30 CET, 7:30 GMT. So probably out of the range of Americans. Certainly if they're available every single week. We've nothing biased against Americans or Canadians or Australians or anyone else. But probably it suits best to be in the European arena. To talk about exactly what we've just discussed. So we're looking, and as well, I should say, we're not necessarily looking for someone who's published as many books as us. If it's someone who is even, you know, finishing up their first book, I'd say we'd be open to that, as long as there's someone who's going to be in this long term and is looking to take their writing seriously, and not just kind of drop the podcast after 2 weeks because they're not into writing anymore or something. So yeah, I don't know whether there was anything else we wanted to go into in the first podcast. Do we want to open a discussion on a unrelated topic as a taster for people?
Let's see what else is on there. It's all about community. We're also trying to be utterly honest here. So if you think we're idiots, then tell us. If you think there's something really important we've missed out, then tell us. And if we like your idea, we'll probably talk about it, give you credit for it. So even if you can't commit to being a co-host, if there's something you want to say, let us know. And maybe we'll be able to do a podcast based around your great idea. Or get you on for an episode to give your explanation of why people with goatees can't write, or whatever it is that you've come up with that's clearly going to be wrong.
Yeah, that's a very good point. We're not, as I say, like we're only early on in our writing careers. We're not geniuses. We're not like masterminds who know everything there is to know about writing and publishing. So if we're doing something wrong, I would love it if people talked in the comments and discussed something related to the subject we're discussing in the podcast, or anything writing related, or even non-writing related if you want to get into discussions of which Jedi is best or something. So yeah, I don't know if we want to talk about anything else. That's only been about half an hour. If we're generally going to try and make this be about 45 minutes, so we don't overstay our welcome. One thing we could go into is outlining and writing a first draft, since that's what we're doing at the moment on Adventure. I don't know if you want to briefly cover that.
Yeah, let's knock that back and forth, and we'd always pick it up again later if it turns out to last a while.
I mean, that tends to be a good kind of rule, not a rule of thumb, a benchmark for what kind of writer someone is as well, the outlining and first draft process, because we've got outliners or pantsers and plotters. So I guess first, since we are aiming this podcast at people who are not as experienced as us, I'll explain what pantsing and plotting is. So plotting is where you plan out to a greater or lesser degree what's going to happen in your book before you start writing it. And pantsing is where you might have a vague idea of what's going to happen in the book, but you start with page 1 and you just start saying, you know, John woke up that morning and it was cloudy outside and blah, 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 and just start writing. And you kind of vaguely know you want to write about John, who is a space engineer, and then you let it go from there and see where it takes you. So on the plotting and pantsing kind of line, so there's people who plot everything and create huge world documents and all kinds of stuff. And there's people who don't know anything at all and just start writing. And I would say I'm towards not the extreme of plotting, but I certainly plot a lot. I outline a lot before I start writing. So I generally have an idea of where a story is going to go from start to finish when I start it. And then when I'm writing the book, I then let the characters take it in a different direction if they want to, which happens every time, pretty much. Like a character, especially a villain, will say, I'm not that stupid. Why are you making me make that dumb decision? And do something else. And then the hero's in trouble. So that's what we've been doing on Adventure. We, as a collaborative process, we come up with an idea, and I tend to write the first little kind of snowflake idea. Snowflaking is where you start with a sentence, and then you make it a paragraph, and then you make it a page, and so on. I snowflake the idea, then I pass it back to Dave, and he comes up with the kind of next level of that idea and some twists on it and things like that, and then I take that and we send it back and forth like that until we end up with something that's thousands of words long, that we could then use to start writing the book. And then just before this meeting here, this podcast, we had a story meeting where I've gotten to about 23,000 words through Adventure, and we're discussing what's going to come next and how the characters are interacting and what they're doing and stuff. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Dave, or...
Well, I'm not a hardcore planner. Potentially I plan my own stuff slightly less than you do. But the one guiding principle I found works for me, not just for outlining or writing first drafts, but for the entire process, is it's always easier to change something that exists than create something entirely new. So if you write out 6 points in your progression from the start of the story to the end, and that's what you've got, and then you try to write all the bits that fill in just as it comes to you, it's easier if you know where you're going. So you head for a point, and then when the next point in your ladder no longer fits the story, you go, well, okay, now I'll change the point, than to set off and not know where you're going. So making the active choice to abandon your previous plan is always, for me, easier, because you're actually doing it because you've come up with a better idea, rather than just because you need to come up with an idea.
Yeah.
Whilst it is possible to write a brilliant story about absolutely anything you can think of, when you're there and you're coming to the words start to stutter out, there are good ideas and bad ideas. The ideas that will create an engaging story and ideas that will be less engaging. So what you want to do is try and filter out the, well, I just need any idea at all, so I'll put something down. If you can trim it down to things that will make it more engaging. So if you do write it out, you can have a series of steps that are interesting. If you want to put twists into the story, you almost need to plan it out carefully so that you're not left going back going, okay, and now I've got to try and put in all of this evidence for the twist.
Yeah, and then as well, if you outline and you have a twist, so say the hero's going to do something clever. If you've outlined it, then you potentially have the freedom then of the villain to say, okay, so this is what I think the hero's going to do, because that would be the clever thing to do. Like, you have to understand that the heroes and the villains are thinking about what the other person is going to be thinking about. So if you've already written it down, you can get to the next level and go, okay, so this is the hero's move. Therefore, the villain would do this move to trap them. Therefore, the hero has to do this move to get out of the trap. It gets you to another, a further point than you would get to if you were just writing it on the fly. I was going to mention Violent Science, which is the third book in the Kairos Sauron series, which I experimented. This was written in November, I think. It only came out. I wrote it in November.
I read the advance copy in late November, so yeah.
Yeah, so October, November time. And I was experimenting, and I only outlined to about a third of the way through the book. So I wrote the first draft up to the third of the way through the book, and then went, holy crap, I have no idea what's going to happen next, and panicked. And then went for a long walk. So that's a thing I use to come up with story ideas, is I go for a walk with no music, no podcasts, nothing, just silence. And then I'm thinking about the story anyway, and kind of ideas process. I went for a long walk and came up with what could happen next that would be interesting, and had then went home and then planned out the next 20,000 words or 15 or whatever, and then wrote that, and then went, holy crap, I've no idea what's going to happen next, and I'm getting close to the end of the book, and how's it going to end if I don't even know what the hell I'm doing? And went for another walk and came up with the idea that then got it to the end. But that reinforced for me that, again, this is making a mistake that then is quite valuable. It reinforced for me the idea of, no, I mean, I've outlined, before then I'd outlined 10 books or whatever, and it had gone well, and this had gone less well. Now, when the book came out, some people said it's their favorite in the series, so it didn't end badly. There ended up being a book that was legible and people could read and enjoy. But from a writing standpoint, it became much less enjoyable to write, because I was in a state of complete limbo, not knowing what was going to come next. And it's better to have a complete cliche that comes next than to have nothing at all. At least for me. I mean, everyone's different, obviously.
The other thing that an outline does that I really love, and I suspect other writers really love, is give you a series of exciting things. So you can actually keep your immersion, your reader excitement density up, so that you don't get the third draft, send it out to people, and they go, well, chapters 5 and 6 don't really do much, and it's rocketing along, and then it kind of slows. So if you've outlined roughly, you know that you've got exciting stuff and you need to fill in. And if you find yourself writing an entire chapter between 2 points on your outline, you don't necessarily fix it there, but you know that if you put an entire chapter between 2 points, that's the place to start looking for a soggy middle, as it were.
I mean, the other thing I would say for my outlining is that I'm compensating for hating editing. That if you pants a first draft, then you're going to be editing it a dozen times to get it to the state where people can read it and enjoy it, because you're just outlining, but you're outlining long form. And I hate editing. I mean, like, it's the worst part of writing for me. I just do it to get through it, I know that books at first draft stage are crap and wouldn't be worth reading, so therefore I have to edit in order to make it something worth reading. But it's something I don't enjoy at all. So in Violent Science again, then, because I hadn't outlined, then I had a lot more editing. I had an extra couple of rounds of editing to get it to a state where it was readable. So yeah, I mean, outlining for me at least is compensating for that. But some people actually like the thing I'm learning more and more, the more I talk to other writers, is that everyone is completely different. And some people love editing and think it's the best part of the whole process and hate first drafts or hate outlining or world building or whatever. So it is a personal kind of thing for me, compensating away from doing the editing as much. Obviously, I still need to edit.
Well, that's another general point, I think, that the only thing that the readers are ever going to see is the copy you release. So how you get from waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning going, but what if penguins could play Yahtzee, to releasing a book, is your process. The only person who you have to actually make happy with that process is you. So if you write best in the shower using dictation software, then that's what you should do. If the best bit of book, the book that gets you to the end, is not knowing what's going to happen next, then maybe pantsing is better for you. What you want to do is just write the idea out, because the real motivator is finding out what happens at the end. And then you're prepared to pay the price in extra editing or in sending the book out for more intensive editing from a professional, because you want that real thrill to keep you going. And if you outline, you lose interest. So if you've tried outlining and it really hasn't worked for you, stick something in the comments with your experience, or drop us a line or whatever.
I mean, there's plenty of big name authors who pants. I mean, Stephen King is famously a pantser. George R. R. Martin, I'm not sure, but my feeling is I've read the first book, but I haven't read all the books. But my feeling is from his writing that he's a pantser, just because of the unpredictability of his stories, that they tend to take sudden right turns. Yeah. And in an outlining stage, you may not have said, okay, then Joe stabs Stan in the face.
Yeah.
Like, oh dear, Stan was meant to be the hero. Joe just stabbed him.
Also, his speed would support that, because I mean, the speed you write at is the speed you write at. There's nothing better about being able to release 5 books a year as opposed to 1 book every 5 years, if the books you're releasing are good. But if you compare George R. R. Martin to, say, Steven Erikson, who are both writing epic fantasy, the speed they release their books suggests, and the amount of talking there is about, well, what's going to happen next before the next book comes out, suggests that even if you account for George R. R. Martin being quite secretive about what he's doing, you get the feel he's coming up with the ideas and he's trying to get the next book cobbled together, and it's not coming out because he hasn't managed to get it together yet. Whereas Stephen Erickson, you get the feel right from the start that he knew the entire thing, and he didn't have an outline for all of the books. But if you went to him, okay, what happens in book 9? He'd give you a paragraph. And so he was able to crank the books out on a regular schedule because he knew everything in at least high level from the start.
So I was going to say, let's not get started on a Game of Thrones discussion, or we'll be here another hour. But anyway, we've gotten to about 45 minutes through. So hopefully there was something of use. Please do comment below. Let us know things you'd like us to talk about, or as Dave said, like if you're a pantser and you didn't enjoy outlining, or vice versa. We'd love to hear it. And we'll be back at the same time next week. So thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you then.